She had been born in the village like any other child, but from the beginning she carried with her a stillness that many did not understand. While others filled their days with laughter and noise, she often lingered near the edges of gatherings, watching with thoughtful eyes, speaking only when she felt her words mattered. Her silence, rather than being recognized as wisdom, was twisted into suspicion. Some whispered that she carried strange energies from her mother's line, that she was a child of shadows rather than a child of light. Others simply saw her difference as a burden, for in a community where conformity was safety, her ways seemed unsettling. Yet within her there was nothing but kindness. She tended to the smallest creatures, mended baskets with patience, and carried food to elders without anyone asking. But good deeds are often forgotten when fear and envy begin to stir. As she grew into womanhood, her beauty became another source of resentment. Her skin glowed like polished bronze, her hair thick and dark as the soil of the forest, her eyes wide with the depth of rivers. Yet it was not her appearance alone that drew attention. There was a gentleness to her spirit, a way she carried herself with dignity, even in hardship, and this stirred envy in those around her. Other women began to feel overshadowed, husbands glanced at her too long, and her own kin worried that her presence would bring unwanted strife. Her silence, her beauty, and her mysterious aura formed a dangerous combination in a world quick to fear what it could not control. And so, whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into accusations, and accusations into decisions that would shape her fate. Her family, who should have shielded her, instead grew weary of her. They said she did not contribute enough, though she worked from dawn until dusk. They said she drew too many glances, though she dressed plainly and kept her eyes lowered. Some even claimed that she brought ill luck, pointing to a poor harvest or a sudden illness as if her presence alone could summon misfortune. The elders of the household gathered one night, the firelight casting long shadows against their tired faces. Her stepmother spoke first, her voice sharp as a blade, declaring that the girl was cursed, that she drained joy from the home. Her father, too weak or too fearful to defend her, nodded along, while her husband, who had once spoken tenderly to her, now called her a weight too heavy to bear. The decision was made not with compassion but with cold efficiency. She would be sent away. When the news was delivered to her, she did not scream or argue. Her eyes glistened, but her lips stayed closed. She had long known that love in this household was conditional, that her place was never secure. Still, the betrayal pierced her deeply, for though she was strong, she had hoped that her goodness would one day be seen. The thought of being cast into the forest, a place of danger and spirits, filled her with quiet dread. The forest was no home for the abandoned. It was a place for exiles, for those deemed unworthy, for those the village no longer wished to claim. To be sent there was to be erased, as though her existence had been a mistake. Yet she bowed her head and accepted her fate, for she understood that resistance would only make her punishment harsher. At dawn, they gathered at the edge of the settlement. Her husband carried no affection in his gaze, only impatience. Her stepmother's eyes held a glint of cruel satisfaction. No one wept for her. A small bundle of food was handed to her as if to quiet the last remains of guilt, though they all knew it would not last long in the wild. The girl walked barefoot, her steps slow, her shoulders trembling, but her head lifted with quiet defiance. Behind her, the village receded into the distance, the huts shrinking, the laughter of children fading until only silence remained. Before her stretched the forest, thick, dark, and endless. Birds called overhead, branches swayed like arms ready to close around her. She inhaled deeply, tasting the scent of damp earth, old bark, and secrets whispered by leaves. Though they saw her as a burden, the forest did not. It opened its shadows to her, folding her into its mystery. And as she stepped across the threshold of exile, a strange calm began to stir inside her. She felt the weight of betrayal, yes, but also a strange flicker of belonging she had never known within her own home. Perhaps, she thought, the forest would listen where her family never had. Perhaps here, among the trees, her silence would no longer be mistaken for curse but understood as strength. She disappeared deeper and deeper into the green, carrying nothing but her wounded heart, her innocent spirit, and a destiny that had only just begun to awaken. They did not simply send her into the forest quietly, as if it were a matter of duty, they turned her exile into a spectacle. At dawn, while the mist still clung to the ground and the cries of morning birds rose into the sky, they dragged her from her sleeping mat. Her stepmother's hands were cold on her arm, gripping her as though she were no more than an unwanted animal being driven out. The girl did not fight back, but tears streaked silently down her cheeks as she tried to gather her few belongings, only for her husband to strike them from her hands. "You need nothing," he spat, his voice thick with disdain. "The forest will give you what you deserve." The bundle of beads, cloth scraps, and keepsakes scattered across the dirt, trampled beneath the feet of those who had once been her kin. The villagers gathered at the edges of the scene, drawn by the cruelty like moths to flame. Some whispered among themselves that this was too harsh, that no woman should be treated in such a way. Yet none stepped forward to defend her for fear of being marked as her ally. Others laughed openly, their faces twisted with malice, sneering at her weakness. One boy picked up her wooden doll, the last memory of her mother, and tossed it into the mud while his friends jeered. The girl bent to pick it up, but her stepmother slapped her across the face and hissed, "Leave it! You will carry nothing of this house with you." The sound of laughter rang in her ears, and for the first time she understood fully how deeply they despised her. They did not walk her to the edge of the forest with quiet dignity, they pushed her like a criminal being marched to punishment. Some hurled words sharper than stones. "Let the spirits eat her bones. The forest will finally silence her. She was never one of us." Every insult dug into her like claws, but still she kept walking, her feet bare, her back straight, her silence unbroken. She would not give them the pleasure of seeing her collapse. Yet inside, her heart was breaking, every beat echoing with betrayal. She had tended their sick, fetched water when no one else would, shared her food with the hungry, and all it earned her was mockery and rejection. When they reached the forest's edge, they did not even offer her a final blessing or farewell. Instead, her husband seized her arm and shoved her forward. She stumbled, catching herself on a root, her knees scraping against the ground. The onlookers laughed at her clumsy fall, as though her suffering were a performance crafted for their amusement. She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her skin, refusing to turn back to face them. Behind her, the voices grew crueler still. Someone imitated her quiet manner of speaking, turning it into a mockery. Another called her cursed, swearing that her shadow alone had soured their harvests. Each voice carried venom, proof that they wanted her gone not just in body but in memory, erased like a mistake carved into stone. Her stepmother's words were the final knife. "May the trees wrap around you and keep you where you belong. Do not return, for you will find no home here." Her husband added, "Better the wolves take you than for us to endure your uselessness." The girl's eyes filled with tears at these words, but she did not let them fall where her betrayers could see. Instead, she blinked them back and turned her face toward the dark wall of trees ahead. The forest loomed tall, its branches whispering secrets she could not yet hear, its shadows swallowing the light of dawn. The people behind her jeered one last time, some spitting into the dirt as if to cleanse themselves of her. And then, as she stepped forward into the dense green, they turned their backs and walked away, their laughter fading into the distance. She stood at the threshold for a long moment, her hands trembling at her sides. The weight of exile pressed heavily on her shoulders. The cruelty of those who abandoned her clung like smoke, choking her spirit. Yet even through her grief, a spark of resilience stirred. She had been treated as nothing, mocked as worthless, cast aside as if her life had no meaning. But she was still alive. Her feet still carried her. Her heart still beat, even if it was bruised. And though they had left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the scars of their cruelty, she was not yet broken. Deeper into the forest she walked, each step swallowing the echoes of laughter that had followed her. The trees closed around her, their trunks ancient, their leaves whispering in the wind. She could still hear faint shouts of mockery carried by the breeze, but soon even that was gone. Only the forest remained, vast and unknowable. She glanced back once, only once, and saw the huts of her village glowing faintly in the distance. They had cast her out as though she were refuse, yet as she looked upon them, she realized that it was not her loss but theirs. For they had thrown away innocence, kindness, and resilience, qualities they would one day wish they had kept close. She turned her face away, stepped fully into the shadows, and let the forest swallow her who. She moved through the forest with hesitant steps, each crack of a twig beneath her bare feet sounding like a warning in the stillness. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and moss, heavy with the scent of old life and older secrets. Fear pressed down on her chest. She had never been so far from the village before, and the forest had always been spoken of in hushed tones, as a place of spirits and mysteries. Yet, despite her trembling hands and racing heart, something in the stillness wrapped around her gently, as if unseen arms sought to cradle her. The deeper she went, the quieter her thoughts became, as though the towering trees themselves listened to her sorrow and carried it into their bark. At first, silence was all that accompanied her. The silence of the forest was not empty but alive. Every shadow seemed to breathe, every branch seemed to lean closer, and every patch of light that broke through the canopy painted her in patterns of gold and green. The quiet did not mock her as the villagers had. It did not jeer or spit, did not shove her down or strip her of dignity. Instead, it seemed to recognize her grief and absorb it, like soil taking in rain. She felt small beneath the endless trunks but not despised. For the first time since she had been cast out, her tears fell freely, unhidden, and the forest bore witness without judgment. Night crept closer, dimming the edges of the world, and shadows stretched across her path. Fear rose again, sharp and piercing. What if wolves lurked, or serpents, or worse, the restless spirits that were said to live in the trees? She wrapped her arms around herself and stumbled onward, her stomach tight with hunger, her throat parched from crying. She thought of the huts she had left behind, of the faces twisted in cruelty, and for a moment despair threatened to crush her. But then a sound broke the silence, not cruel laughter, not the hiss of her stepmother's voice, but something softer. The rustle of leaves, though no wind stirred. She froze, listening. The noise came again, a faint murmur, low and melodic, as though words were woven into the shifting canopy. She turned her face upward, staring at the branches that swayed in still air. Her heart hammered in her chest, but the sound was not frightening, it was strangely comforting. Like a lullaby sung from long ago, a voice without shape or tongue. The more she listened, the more certain she became that the forest was not silent at all. It was speaking. The whispers were faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of bark and the sigh of leaves. Yet they pressed against her ears in a rhythm that felt familiar, as if they had always been there, waiting for her to notice. She could not make out words, but the intent was clear. You are not alone. The girl's breath caught, and she felt warmth in her chest where only sorrow had lived before. Her body sagged with exhaustion, yet she leaned against the base of a tall tree and closed her eyes, listening to the secret voices. They seemed to weave themselves into her heartbeat, steadying her, easing the sting of betrayal. As she sat there, she thought of her mother, of the gentle stories whispered to her at night, tales of spirits who lived in roots and leaves, watching over those who suffered unjustly. The villagers had mocked those tales, calling them childish fancies. But now here, surrounded by the immense presence of the forest, she wondered if her mother had known the truth. Perhaps the trees had always spoken, only ignored by those who refused to listen. The longer she remained, the stronger the whispers became. Not loud enough to frighten, but insistent, curling through her thoughts, washing away despair. They told her nothing directly, yet she understood that she was safe beneath their boughs, that her exile had led her not to death but to sanctuary. Where the village had cast her away with scorn, the forest received her with stillness, shadows, and quiet voices of comfort. It was a strange solace, born not from human kindness but from something older, deeper, and more enduring. When at last she lay down upon the roots, her body aching from the long walk, she felt the ground soften beneath her like a bed. She closed her eyes, and the whispers swirled around her like a song without beginning or end. Though hunger gnawed at her stomach and fear still lurked at the edges of her mind, the forest's silence, alive and watchful, wrapped her in an unseen embrace. For the first time she did not feel entirely abandoned. The second night in the forest came with heavier shadows. She had grown used to the quiet murmurs, the strange comfort of leaves rustling without wind. But now, as darkness fell, the whispers thickened. They no longer sounded like mere rustling. No, they pressed against her ears like voices that had always been there, waiting for her sorrow to awaken them. She sat upright against the trunk of a towering Irako tree, her hands clutched around her knees, listening. The forest no longer soothed her with its silence. It spoke. At first, the words were faint, like echoes carried through hollows in the bark. We see you. We know your pain. Her breath caught, and she raised her head, eyes wide, searching for who had spoken. But no one was there. Only the vast pillars of trees surrounding her, their branches curling into the night sky. She pressed her back harder into the trunk. Her heart should have been pounding in fear, but instead she felt something different. Recognition, like hearing her own sorrow reflected back to her. The whispers grew clearer, weaving together from many voices, deep like roots, sharp like branches scraping the air. They cast you out. They mocked you. They left you to die. The words coiled around her like smoke. Her throat tightened, tears springing again, but this time they were not of weakness. The trees were not only comforting her, they were bearing witness. They remembered her suffering. You are not forgotten. She rose to her feet, trembling. Who are you? She whispered into the night. Her voice sounded fragile against the chorus, but the forest responded without hesitation. We are the old ones. We are the watchers. We are the roots beneath their homes, the wood that builds their fires, the shade they take for granted. The trees seemed to creak as though they shifted closer, their branches swaying though the air was still. And now we are yours. Her lips parted. What? The forest hummed, an endless chorus of whispers. Your pain is our pain. Your exile is our exile. You are bound to us and we to you. Through you we shall speak. Through you we shall strike. The words sent a shiver coursing through her. She pressed her palms against the bark of the tree behind her and felt a pulse, slow, steady like a heartbeat. The trees began to echo her memories. She could hear her stepmother's cruel laughter in the wind, the villagers' mocking jeers carried on the creaking branches. Her anger rose, hot and fierce, and the whispers twisted with her emotions. They took your dignity. They fed you to shadows. Do you wish to let them live unpunished? The forest grew louder, voices layering until they felt like thunder rolling in her skull. Her fists clenched. For the first time she allowed the rage she had swallowed for so long to rise fully. No, she whispered. The sound was small, but the trees hissed with approval. Then take our strength. A sharp wind swept through the clearing though the sky above was still. Leaves rattled like 1,000 tiny drums, branches groaned and bent, and she felt a surge through her veins, wild, unearthly, like sap and storm had poured into her blood. Her body trembled, not from weakness but from a raw new energy, ancient and untamed. The forest whispered all around her, every voice carrying the same promise. You will not be powerless again. The whispers began to shape her sorrow into something new. Your tears are rivers, make them floods. Your cries are storms, let them break roofs. Your heart is fire, burn what was rotten long before you. Each word struck her chest, filling her with a wrath that no exile could silence. She staggered, gripping the tree as though it anchored her. The bark cut into her skin, but instead of pain she felt the tree's strength flowing into her, veins and roots entwined with her own. Visions flashed in her mind, not her own but gifts of the forest. Her stepmother crying out as roots broke through her hut's floor, villagers stumbling as vines wound around their ankles, men gasping as trees bent low to crush their spears. The images came so vividly that she gasped aloud, pressing her hands to her face. The trees whispered gently now as if soothing her shock. Not yet. But soon. She fell to her knees, overwhelmed. Why me? She asked, voice trembling. The trees answered with 1,000 sighs. Because you were cast aside. Because you were broken and left to the dark. And only those who have tasted sorrow know how to wield its power. You will be our voice. You will be our vengeance. The words filled her with a strange certainty. For the first time since her exile, she felt not like a victim but like a vessel, chosen, filled with the strength of something older and mightier than the cruelty of men. She stood again, taller this time, though her body was weary. The forest bent with her, leaves shivering, roots stirring beneath the soil. The whispers were no longer faint, they were inside her now, coiled in her chest, rising with her breath. We are with you. Always. When they dream we will haunt them. When they feast we will rot their food. When they laugh we will choke their throats with ash. Through you we shall make them remember. And though the girl's eyes were still wet with tears, they gleamed now with something fiercer than grief, something born of pain, sharpened by betrayal, and tempered by the whispers of the forest. She woke the next morning with dew clinging to her skin, and for a moment she thought she had dreamed the voices. The forest looked the same as always, towering trunks, a canopy so dense that sunlight trickled down in fractured beams, and the low hum of insects stirring. But when she pressed her hand to the bark of the tree she had leaned against in the night, she felt it again, the faint pulse like a slow heartbeat deep beneath the wood. It wasn't a dream. The trees were alive with her pain and she was alive with theirs. She rose and walked barefoot across the mossy ground. Each step seemed to awaken something beneath her, roots shifting as if they recognized her presence. The earth did not resist her, it embraced her. When she wept silently, the soil drank her tears like rain. When she breathed heavily, the leaves above shuddered as though echoing her sorrow back into the air. The line between herself and the forest was fading. She was no longer just a girl banished to its depths. She was a thread woven into its endless tapestry of roots, branches, and shadows. As the days passed, she stopped fearing the silence. At night, when the whispers returned, she did not cower. Instead, she listened. Each voice spoke of strength hidden in sorrow, of power rooted in pain. Her heart had been broken by betrayal, but here, among the trees, her brokenness became a gift. Her grief sank into the ground, and she imagined it running through the roots like water. She could feel the forest drinking from her sorrow, feeding on it, and in return, it offered her its strength. She began to notice small changes. When she was hungry, branches bent low to offer fruit she had never seen ripen so quickly. When she was cold, leaves fell in thick layers to cover her like blankets. And when she was restless, the forest would hum with her thoughts, the rustle of leaves shifting to match the rhythm of her heart. She was no longer alone. She was never alone. The forest itself seemed to breathe with her. When her anger swelled at the memory of her family's cruelty, the wind surged through the branches in violent bursts. When she recalled their mocking laughter, the trees groaned as if straining under the weight of her rage. And when she thought of how they had cast her away like a burden, vines trembled and reached toward her, curling at her feet as though ready to defend her. She saw now that her pain was not wasted, it was fuel, and the forest drank deeply from it. In turn she began to speak back. She told the trees her story in full, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier as the days went on. She spoke of how she had always tried to be good, how she had been gentle, how she had sought only to love and belong. She spoke of how they had mocked her innocence, how her husband, or was it her kin, she could not bear to separate the cruelty any more, had cast her away with no thought for her suffering. She confessed that she had wished to die that first night, to let the shadows take her. And as she spoke, the forest listened. The responses grew clearer, almost melodic. The leaves rustled not randomly but in patterns that matched her words. When she cried, the branches swayed, sighing like mourners. When she clenched her fists in anger, the earth trembled faintly beneath her feet. Each time, she felt the bond tighten, as though her very emotions were weaving her deeper into the fabric of this vast living being. One evening, as dusk bled into night, she sat with her back against the iroko tree again. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. This time she didn't just hear the whispers, she felt them move through her chest, through her blood, as though the forest's voice was her own. "You are ours," it murmured. "And we are yours. Your sorrow feeds us. Your anger strengthens us. Your heart beats in our roots." She pressed her palm to the tree's bark, and it was warm beneath her hand. A strange certainty washed over her. The forest was not only her refuge, it was her kin now. She had been rejected by blood, by husband, by home, but here she was claimed. Here she belonged. With each passing day she moved more like the forest itself. Her footsteps grew softer, like falling leaves. Her eyes sharpened, catching every flicker of movement like a hawk in the branches. Her body, once frail from neglect, seemed to draw vigor from the soil and the fruit, her skin carrying the scent of bark and earth. When she laughed, a sound rare but raw, the forest seemed to echo it back, 1,000 leaves rustling in delight. When she grew silent, the silence deepened into something profound, heavy with meaning. But the bond was not only comfort, it was power. She realized this when a rabbit, trapped in a hunter's snare at the edge of the woods, cried out in pain. She felt its terror as though it were her own. She stumbled, clutching her chest, before anger surged inside her. The trees near the snare creaked loudly, branches whipping with invisible force, snapping the trap in half. The rabbit scurried free. She fell to her knees, breathless, and the forest whispered, "Through you we act." Her sorrow had become the root's nourishment. Her anger had become the leaves' cry. Her bond with the forest was no longer something she merely felt, it was something she wielded, something that would grow, something that would one day return her pain to those who had cast her away. The girl who had been abandoned was gone. In her place was someone the trees had chosen, someone whose heart beat with the rhythm of roots and whose wrath whispered in the leaves. She was no longer just a victim. She was becoming the forest itself. At first, it began with small, almost unnoticeable things the villagers dismissed as ordinary tricks of the night. A faint creaking of branches scraping across the thatched roofs, the sound carried by the wind like a restless spirit wandering the edges of sleep. Some muttered it was the season of storms, that the trees bent too low because of heavy rains. Yet the skies were clear and the winds calm, and still the branches clawed at the huts as if guided by unseen hands. Children woke in the dark, trembling, swearing they had heard voices whispering outside their windows. Not the voices of men or women, but the hissing murmur of many mouths speaking at once, their words impossible to catch yet heavy with meaning. Mothers gathered their little ones close, muttering prayers and sprinkling ash on the thresholds. Fathers lit fires to ward off the night, though the flames seemed weaker than before, as if swallowed by the shadows stretching in from the forest. The strangeness spread from the edges of the village inward. Paths once smooth began to crack. At first, it was only fissures in the dust, but soon thick roots forced their way upward, curling like serpents across walkways. No one could step without noticing them. The roots split water pots, pushed aside woven baskets and coiled against the doors of huts. The villagers tried to cut them back, but the roots seemed to bleed sap thick and red, staining knives and axes. And when they awoke the next day, the roots had grown back stronger, as though mocking their efforts. Whispers grew louder with each night that passed. Those who walked home late swore that the air itself spoke. Some said they heard a girl's cry, faint and sorrowful, carried with the sound of rustling leaves though not a single breeze stirred the branches. Others claimed they heard laughter, not joyous but bitter, rising from the treeline and vanishing just as quickly. Old women began to murmur that the forest had grown restless, that something they had done, something terrible, had returned to haunt them. The whispers reached into dreams. Men woke screaming, sweat pouring from their brows, clutching their ears as if voices still hissed within them. They spoke of nightmares filled with trees whose branches twisted into arms, pulling them under the earth. Women dreamt of shadows pressing against their huts, watching, listening. Children wet their mats, whispering that the girl, banished, forgotten, walked in their sleep, her eyes hollow but her mouth full of words too sharp to hear. At the heart of the village, elders gathered in hushed tones, trying to calm the people. They declared it was nothing but imagination, fear stirred by superstition. Yet even as they spoke, the earth groaned beneath their feet, and one of the roots split the floor of their council hut, rising between them like a finger pointing at their guilt. They sat in silence, unable to explain what had happened, their eyes darting to one another with unspoken dread. The animals knew it too. Goats bleated in terror at night, pulling against their ropes until their necks were raw. Dogs refused to leave the safety of huts, their ears pressed flat, their bodies trembling at sounds no one else could hear. Chickens scattered wildly as shadows passed over the ground though the sky was empty. Even the birds stopped singing, their silence a warning that the village could not ignore. On the third night of unrest, something more sinister unfolded. A boy ran screaming through the village, saying the trees had spoken his name. He had been fetching water near the forest's edge when he heard his name whispered by 1,000 voices, rising and falling in perfect unison. He swore he felt a hand brush against his shoulder, though when he turned, there was nothing but leaves. His terror spread quickly, for others began to confess the same, that the whispers were not random but personal, intimate, calling each of them as though the forest knew their names, their secrets, their guilt. The people no longer dared to walk near the trees. Fires were lit at the village's edge and charms were hung across doorways. Still, the happenings grew worse. Roots wound themselves around hut poles, tightening until the wood groaned. Branches reached down to scratch not only the roofs but the walls, scraping long lines like claws across mud and clay. In the dark, some swore they saw figures moving among the trees, tall, shifting, their shapes neither man nor beast, their eyes glowing faintly before vanishing into shadow. By now, no one doubted it. The whispers were the voice of the forest, and the forest was no longer silent. Some whispered of the girl who had been cast out, the one their cruelty had condemned. They said the trees had claimed her, that she now spoke through their roots and branches, her sorrow carried on the wind, her anger in the groan of wood. Others refused to speak her name at all, fearing it would draw her nearer. Sleep abandoned the village. Fear hung over every meal, every conversation, every breath. The people knew that something was coming. The forest had grown too loud, too close. The whispers that once seemed like distant murmurs now pressed at their very walls, seeping into their ears, curling into their bones. And though none dared to say it aloud, each villager carried the same unspoken thought. Their cruelty had not been buried in silence. The banished girl had returned, not in body but in voice, in root, in branch. The forest had become her mouth, and its whispers were only the beginning. It began with the ground itself trembling, not with the violence of an earthquake but with the slow, deliberate stirring of something alive beneath the soil. The villagers had spent sleepless nights dreading the whispers that seeped from the forest, but when the wrath of the trees revealed itself, there was no longer any doubt that the banished girl had returned through the woods themselves. At dawn, men stepped out of their huts to find their paths blocked not by stones or weeds, but by roots as thick as their arms, curling across the ground like serpents. They hacked at them with machetes, but the roots bled sap that steamed as if boiling, and the stench clung to their skin like rot. The forest was no longer still, it watched, it breathed, it moved. By nightfall, the branches began to stir as though caught in an unseen wind, though the air in the village was calm and heavy. Leaves shook violently, falling in showers that blanketed huts and fields, not fresh and green but dry and brittle, like leaves torn from trees in deep winter. When villagers tried to sweep them aside, the leaves rose on their own, swirling in spirals like tiny storms, cutting against their skin as if sharpened. Some claimed to hear the sound of a girl's laughter hidden inside the hiss of the leaves, mocking, reminding, accusing. Mothers clutched their children close, eyes darting toward the forest edge, afraid to see what moved beyond the shadows. The trees themselves began to stretch and groan, their branches elongating in ways no tree should move. At night, villagers peered from their huts and swore they saw entire trunks shifting, inching closer to the village with a slow, creeping hunger. The sound was unbearable, wood splitting, bark grinding, roots tearing free from the earth, dragging forward like monstrous limbs. By morning, trees that once stood far away seemed to loom nearer, their branches hovering over the huts as if poised to strike. Even the elders, who had tried to dismiss the whispers as superstition, fell silent when they realized the forest was advancing. Those who had cast the girl away were the first to feel the fury. One man, who had laughed as she was dragged to exile, woke to find roots snaking across his floor, curling around his ankles while he slept. By the time his family heard his screams, the roots had tightened, pulling him through the cracks in his hut until he vanished into the earth, leaving only the faint echo of snapping bones. Another woman, who had spat at the girl's feet when she was banished, ran through the village one evening, clawing at her face as a storm of leaves surrounded her. The leaves clung like thousands of tiny blades, slicing into her skin until she collapsed, her body covered in shallow wounds that bled endlessly though no leaf touched her again. Storms of bark and branches tore across the fields, ruining crops and breaking fences. Goats strangled in their ropes as vines twisted around their throats. Chickens were found shredded by splinters, their feathers scattered like warnings. At night, the villagers huddled in silence, but silence offered no safety. Whispers filled their huts, pressing against their ears, naming them one by one, the voices of trees repeating names in low, hollow tones, the same names as those who had cheered when the girl was cast into the forest. The accused shook with terror, pleading with their neighbors for help, but no one dared step forward. One evening, the sky itself darkened without a storm. The sun bled red at the horizon, and the forest groaned louder than thunder. From within, a great wind rose, not cool but hot and dry, carrying with it a choking storm of dust and leaves. The trees bent unnaturally in unison, their branches twisting like arms pointing toward the village. The wind carried the girl's voice, clear, unmistakable, no longer whispers but a cry of vengeance. Her sorrow was in the wail of the wind, her rage in the snapping branches, her strength in the storm that crashed against the huts. Huts collapsed beneath falling limbs. Fires sparked from friction as branches scraped against thatched roofs. People scattered in every direction, but there was no escape. Roots cracked open the paths, vines lashed at their legs, branches swung like clubs. Some fell to the ground, pleading, begging forgiveness, but the forest did not forgive. They had cast her out, mocked her tears and left her to the darkness, but the darkness had embraced her, and now the forest had become her voice. By the time the night ended, the village was in ruin. Half the huts lay in splinters, crops were flattened, animals were gone, and those who had plotted her exile were nowhere to be found, dragged away into the forest's shadow. The survivors sat trembling in the rubble, their ears still ringing with the girl's cries woven into the wind. The wrath of the forest had left its mark, and no one who lived through it doubted the truth. The banished girl had returned not in flesh but in root and bark, in storm and whisper. The trees stood tall at the village's edge, unmoving once more, but their branches hung heavy, as if still remembering the vengeance they had unleashed. No one dared cut them, no one dared approach. The villagers kept their distance, whispering prayers, knowing that the wrath of the forest was not finished. It waited, watching, ready to rise again should cruelty ever return to their hearts. The survivors of the village moved through their days with a weight pressing upon their shoulders, a constant reminder of the forest's wrath. Each step they took was measured, cautious, as if even the ground beneath them could betray their presence to the trees that had once carried the girl's vengeance. No one dared venture close to the forest edge, where the shadows of twisted branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers, waiting to claim anyone who dared approach. Mothers clutched their children tightly, whispering prayers under their breaths, and even the strongest men of the village walked with bowed heads, their eyes darting nervously to the perimeter of the woods. In the mornings, the wind carried subtle hints of what had happened, though the sun shone and the day seemed ordinary. A fallen leaf would spiral unnaturally, landing at someone's feet with a soft but deliberate tap, and the survivor would jump, heart hammering, imagining the girl's eyes behind the bark. The sound of a snapping twig in the distance, a sound once harmless, now made them freeze in terror. Birds refused to perch near the village. Their songs had fallen silent, leaving only an eerie hush that seemed to stretch endlessly. Animals, once calm and familiar, now skittered in frantic patterns, sensing the lingering force of the girl entwined with the forest. Even inside their homes, the survivors felt her presence. At night, the whispers would creep through the cracks in walls, faint and low at first, like the rustling of leaves, until they became unmistakable. The girl's voice calling names, recounting sins, reminding each one of the cruelty they had shown. Sleep became a rare refuge. Many spent nights huddled together, unable to close their eyes, fearing that if they did, the girl might appear to them in dreams, or that branches might break through their windows, reaching for them with cold, relentless determination. Every meal was now shadowed by dread. Even the simplest tasks, fetching water, tending to livestock, repairing roofs, were performed with hands trembling and eyes constantly scanning the forest. Those who had once laughed at her plight now flinched at every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves. A simple breeze through the trees could trigger memories of the night of her wrath, of the snapping branches, of the roots that dragged her tormentors into the earth. The survivors could not speak of her without shivering. Her name itself had become a talisman and a curse. Saying it aloud felt like summoning the girl from the shadows, reminding them that she had not been forgotten, and that the forest remained loyal to her. Parents taught their children to fear even the smallest act of cruelty. Tales of her vengeance were recounted at night, voices quivering, to ensure that no young heart in the village ever repeated the mistakes of their elders. "Do not anger the forest," they would whisper. "Do not betray the innocent." Every glance at the edge of the woods, every trembling leaf, was a warning. The girl's presence lingered like a cold hand on the neck of every survivor, a reminder that vengeance is not easily forgotten and that injustice leaves traces long after the act itself. In the marketplace, people avoided speaking of the events aloud, yet rumors traveled faster than wind. Even merchants who dealt in everyday goods found themselves pausing mid-sentence when a shadow fell across their wares, fearing it was the girl observing them. Her story had woven itself into the fabric of the village, a constant hum of tension, a tapestry of fear. Laughter became rare, and when it occurred, it was quiet, nervous, and always followed by a glance toward the forest. Those who attempted to rebuild their lives found that the forest did not forgive easily. Crops that were planted too close to the edge withered overnight, and small fires that were lit to scare away animals would mysteriously extinguish, leaving only smoldering ashes. Each misfortune was interpreted as a sign that the girl was watching, judging, reminding them that the balance of justice had been restored in ways they could neither fully understand nor escape. Even the bravest among them learned caution. Men who once hunted freely near the forest now stayed within sight of the village center. Women who ventured to gather water or firewood did so in groups, whispering her name under their breath, as if the utterance itself could appease her lingering wrath. Every heartbeat was a reminder that she had not truly been banished, that the forest was an extension of her power, and that they lived each day under her silent, persistent gaze. Generations later, the survivors' children grew up with stories of the banished girl who returned through the forest, who punished cruelty, and whose vengeance could reach across the living and the dead. The survivors themselves remained haunted, their eyes always flicking toward the treeline, their voices trembling whenever her name was mentioned. The forest's whispers had become a permanent echo in the village, a chilling reminder that injustice never truly fades, that those who wrong the innocent live with fear, and that the girl, carried by the trees themselves, remained ever watchful. Even as the years passed, no one dared to speak her name without reverence and fear. Every rustle of leaves, every creaking branch, every shadow stretching long in the moonlight reminded the village that she was still there, still listening, still ready to rise in wrath should anyone dare repeat the cruelty of their ancestors. Her presence was eternal, a lesson etched into the bones of the village, whispered in dread by the trembling survivors, and remembered by all who lived in the shadow of the forest's power. Generations after the events of that fateful night, the village had transformed in ways subtle yet profound. The scars of the past, etched not on flesh but on memory, had been passed down from parent to child. Parents, their voices trembling with a mixture of reverence and fear, would gather their little ones at night to speak of the girl who had been cast into the forest and of the wrathful trees that had carried her back. By the flickering firelight, they would whisper warnings that no one dared speak aloud during the day. Never abandon the innocent, never mock their pain, and never forget that the forest remembers. Every tear shed in the past had been absorbed into the soil, into the roots, into the very essence of the trees, and generations were reminded that the forest never forgets. The children, eyes wide with both curiosity and terror, would cling to their parents as the story unfolded. They were told of the girl's quiet kindness, her gentle spirit, and the cruel fate that had been forced upon her. They learned how jealousy and malice had driven her family to exile, how she had wandered the forest alone, and how the trees had listened, whispered, and finally exacted their vengeance. The forest, it was said, had not only protected her but had become an extension of her power, responding to her pain and anger with uncanny precision. Children imagined branches moving on their own, roots twisting underfoot, and leaves rustling with voices that could speak even when no human was near. As the tale was recounted year after year, it became more than just a story, it became a moral compass for the village. Adults used it to teach humility, compassion, and respect for the vulnerable. Even the most hardened villagers, who had long forgotten their own ancestors' mistakes, felt a chill in their bones when speaking of the girl. They would warn their children that cruelty leaves an imprint not only in hearts but in the world itself, and that those who harm the innocent may one day find themselves haunted, not by ghosts but by nature itself. The legend was preserved through songs, proverbs, and nightly tales. Elders would sit near the hearth, recounting in detail how the trees had risen at the girl's call, how their whispers had guided her through the forest, and how they had returned to punish those who had wronged her. "The forest never forgets," became a refrain that echoed in every household. Children repeated it to each other in playful murmurs, but the weight of its meaning was never lost. They learned to treat each creature, each neighbor, and each stranger with care, knowing that the world's balance was delicate and that the forest's memory was eternal. Even the physical landscape bore the legend. The forest's edge was approached with caution. Parents warned children not to wander too far among the trees, to respect the silent watchers within. Travelers passing near the village would notice a peculiar hush in the air, as if the very leaves carried a warning. Occasionally, a branch would sway unnaturally or a bird would fall silent mid-flight, and villagers would nod knowingly, whispering the girl's name under their breath. The memory of her journey through suffering, and the forest's role in her vengeance, was alive in every shadow, every rustle, and every sigh of wind through the trees. The story also served to remind the village of empathy and resilience. Children grew up hearing how the girl, despite her suffering and isolation, had found strength in the whispers of the forest. They understood that injustice, cruelty, and jealousy could awaken forces beyond human control, and that true power often arose from patience, endurance, and a connection to the natural world. Through generations, the legend instilled both fear and respect, ensuring that no one in the village, or any nearby settlement, dared replicate the same acts of malice that had once led to her exile. As decades passed, the tale evolved with each telling, yet its core truth remained unaltered. The girl's innocence, the cruelty she endured, and the forest's retribution became the pillars of a living myth. Scholars and storytellers visiting the village would note how the villagers' eyes widened with awe when recounting the events, how their voices grew hushed when speaking of the girl, and how even the youngest children internalized the message. Injustice towards the innocent is never forgotten, and the world itself has ways of balancing the scales. By the time new generations had grown into adulthood, the legend had solidified into a guiding principle. Young mothers and fathers passed it down to their children as they went about daily life, turning ordinary moments into lessons of caution and respect. A child who teased another would be reminded of the girl in the forest. A harsh word spoken in anger would be tempered by the memory of the trees that had heard every tear. Even the very soil seemed sacred, carrying echoes of the past and whispers of the girl's enduring presence. And so, the forest remained a living testament to the tale. Its trees were more than mere wood and leaves, they were guardians, witnesses, and messengers. They whispered warnings to all who would listen, ensuring that innocence was protected and cruelty remembered. The villagers lived under the watchful gaze of the trees, forever aware that the past was present in every rustle, every sigh of wind, and every shadow among the roots. The girl's story became immortal, a legend woven into the fabric of daily life, carried in song and memory, and etched into the hearts of all who dwelt in the shadow of the whispering trees. No parent, no elder, no storyteller ever failed to remind the children that the forest remembers. Each tear shed, each act of cruelty, and each injustice lingers in its roots and branches. To wrong the innocent is to awaken forces far greater than oneself, and to be watched eternally by the forest is to live in unending dread. The legend endured, a powerful moral spanning generations, ensuring that the lessons of compassion, justice, and reverence for life were never forgotten. Even now, when the wind stirs through the trees, when the branches groan in the night, and when shadows shift along the forest floor, the villagers remember the girl who had been banished, the forest that had answered her cries, and the enduring warning: the world remembers and the innocent are never truly alone.